G'day, welcome to Pay It Forward. Today I was in the mood for a really quick and easy pattern, something you can make up in a morning, and I thought I'd go to my Mama series and create a little raccoon for you all. Mama raccoon, I've been wanting to make one of these for a while. So this is an absolute great beginner pattern. And as I said, really quick and easy. I've got your free pattern all ready for you. All you need to do is find that link in the description box below. I'm also going to put it number one in the comments for you, so it's really easy to find. What you'll find there will be your free pattern templates that you can print out on your own home printer. So if you go to print those pattern templates out, make sure that you check in your printer settings that you're printing at actual size, because that keeps everything the right size. Your pattern pieces will be all spot on. So let's get busy making my little Mama raccoon. So here are the things we'll need to make Mama raccoon. So we start with our body pieces, and I have just chosen a grey print. Now if you're going to be making this raccoon up in traditional sort of colours, I'm going for a grey base for the back and the front, and I have interfaced that fabric with my fusible woven interfacing, and I've just gone for that mid-tone grey. And then we're going to need our face pieces. And I'm keeping it all very simple, and I'm going with felt for my main face piece, and I have fusible webbing applied to that. It will sit straighter without it, so you can see that one is just going to sit there in place. And then also with the felt, I just think felt works best for these pieces. We're going to be adding those little eye patches, which are typically raccoon in the black. So if we go for a really white base and the very, very black on these patches, and make sure that we keep to those, the rest of your colours can really be quite different and funky if you like. So we've also got a nose piece, and that has the fusible webbing applied as well. And then we're going to need eyes. Now this can get a bit tricky, because if you just take an eye, ideally we would have a black eye, but it really won't show up. So I like to cut just a little circle of felt that's going to tuck in behind that eye, and then when we add that eye we can get a lovely little soulful little look there. And the size of that circle that you cut out will depend on the size of your button for your eye. You can use safety eyes with this project, it will work just as well. I do like to add the buttons. I like all of this series, I tend to use buttons. It just keeps it very homely and simple looking, but definitely the safety eyes will work really well too. So we've got our two little pieces there. They also have that fusible webbing applied, and I'll have my other little button, which I have at the moment lost. There it is, and pop that, oops, slippery little suckers. Okay, pop that one on there. And we're going to be stitching in a little mouth there. And there's a little fly joined me. Going to be stitching on a little mouth there. And that's about it for our facial features. We're going to add ear tips. I think adding those little black ear tips really helps us recognise that little raccoon look. And then we're going to need our arm pieces. So our arm pieces I cut in a black print, so it's a black self print there, and you've got your two pairs, and they are going to be either side there, and in those is going to be a little filler, and I've used felt. So my felt also has that fusible webbing applied, so I can just press it onto the inside. My arm pieces are interfaced also with that same woven interfacing, so I've got my two fillers for the arms. And then we need a tail. So this tail is going to be attached at the back with a button, so we need a nice button, and I've got that one there, and it will wrap around the front and it will tuck under our little baby when baby is sitting there. And I think if you can find a stripe, then you're really going to bring this whole project in together. So you can see that already there we're getting that real raccoon look, and that's what we want. So inside of that tail is also a filler, which just gives it a little bit more volume. So we've got that one cut out with the same felt. We need a base, so we need a base support, And that is, you've got your template there. I've cut that from 2 pieces of matte board and then I've glued them together. This is picture framing matte board that I get from my local picture framer. I just get all of his offcuts. So, and then we need a base felt disc to cover that once we've drawn that in. And that one is just interfaces also. It has got interfacing on it, it's just black. So those are all our parts for Mama. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to be making our little baby. So we've got our baby's body, and that's just cut from double felt. Now double felt is made by fusing 2 pieces of felt together, and then you cut your shapes from that. I'm going to put a link to my video that talks about preparing felt. I'll put that up the top there for you. You can have a look at that. And then we've got our arm pieces also cut with double felt, so they'll sit there. That little arm will sit over Mama's arm. And then we've got our head pieces. So our head pieces, we're actually going to be adding a little bit of filling to those. So they are cut from felt with interfacing applied. We've got our 2 pieces there, front and back. And then we have our little bandit raccoon visor there that will go across, and that's felt with fusible webbing applied. I'm keeping this baby really simple in design so that the design is all very striking. So I'm actually going to use a button for this little one's nose because I have a tiny doll button. Alternatively, you could use a bead or you could just make a couple of little stitches to create a nose. So that's also it for our baby, except for baby's little tail. And I'm using some little beads there, and you can see I've just strung them up on a double strand of extra strong thread, and that's ready to go in. And we're going to sew that one onto the back of the body, and we're going to take those stitches through and create a tiny little belly button. So that's how we're going to be able to stitch it on. But I think that's just a nice, very simple, easy little effect. Because of it being a raccoon, we do really need that one to have a little tail of some description. If you have a braid or a little cord that works, you could do that as well. The attachment is where it gets tricky. So trust me, the little beads work really well. So you're also going to be needing your extra strong threads in various colours to suit your project. I've got some Pearl thread ready for stitching in my little mouth section, and a little bit of blanket stitching that we do. And it's not very much. You can sew up most of this one on your machine, which is good. You're also going to need a snap fastener, a nice big one for her mama's hands to be able to snap closed and hold her baby. You could also make 2 babies. That's entirely up to you. I'm just going to be showing you the one today. You'll need some clear craft glue, something that's suitable for fabric, and we're going to be filling with polyester filling. So that's about it, your usual sewing requirements. So we're going to start with Mama, and let's move everything we don't need out of the way. So the 2 pieces we're going to start with are, well, the 3 pieces actually are her ear pieces, and we're going to remove those backing papers and we're going to press those into place. They line up exactly with the top of the ear. So you want to press those into place, and then we're going to add that face piece. Now that face piece sits 3 centimetres from the top of the head to the very point of that indent there. So you really want to make sure it's positioned correctly, because once we put this one all together and fill it, we need that face to be exactly where it needs to be in the right position. So I will line that up, and I will also make sure that it's perfectly centered from each side of the head. So using a hot iron and a protective cloth, you can get those pressed into place, and then you can go ahead and you can sew those in place. You don't have to sew around this top edge. So I will just sew a close little tight zigzag across those bottom edges, and that is how I'm going to applique them on. And you can also do the same with this face section here. Now, you can do a straight stitch if you like. You could, if you're sewing this one by hand, you could use a blanket applique stitch to go all around that edge. It's entirely up to you, but I'm going to show you that it can be all done on the machine today, and it's actually a really nice neat result. So we'll get those first pieces all pressed and stitched into place. Our next step, once we have those pieces stitched on, is to add the nose. I add the nose now before the eye patches because it's much easier to get it nice and accurate and in the middle if you do it now. And it is 1 centimetre from the very base, that's where it sits. And I've just stitched around that one just with a straight stitch. So now we take our eye patches and they're just going to go, they sit a little lower than the white template here and quite close to the edge, but they come into the centre, and you do need to position them that way. So there's only a little bit of space between them here. The reason for that is raccoon's eyes are very close together and we really want to give that effect. So make sure that they're tilted in, and we don't want them lining up with the edge here because then our eye position will be all wrong. So make sure they're tilted in, they're sitting a little lower and not much space between them. It's probably around about 3/4 of a centimetre between that centre point there. So now we get those pressed into place and you can stitch those into place with your preferred method. There we go, I have those eye patches in place and we're now going to add just a little smile. So I've just used a very fine marker pen and I've just drawn in, you can use just the edge of a cotton reel, the edge of a button, just to draw in a little smile. Now you can do a full smile, you can do a little half smile. I tend to find as a general rule of thumb that if you've got a design that's really symmetrical, and everything's very well lined up like this one is, it can get a little too perfect, is a little boring. So we want to break it up a little, so I do a little half smile. So, and I've just drawn that in there, and I have my pearl thread. This one is an 8-ply, just a single strand, and I'm just going to come in from behind at my starting point there at the very beginning. And I'm just going to make tiny little stitches. I'm going to go back through, and it's really just a linked back stitch that we use in embroidery, and that's going to create a nice visible little line there. Pull that one through, and then I'm going to come in from behind again a little bit further along, following that little pen mark and back into that same hole that I just came out of, so that it's nicely linked and there's no white spaces between your stitches, sorry. So you can see I'm just going to continue and stitch that little mouth line in. So the final thing for our face details, now I've got that little smile in there, I've added my 2 white under eye circles, and I've just pressed them into place, and I've marked where my buttons are going to be going, and you want to have more of that white showing under the eye than above the eye, so that it gives that little soulful sort of a look there. But we're not adding those now, we're going to add them when the body is fully stuffed and put together, so we can pull those eyes in. And I'm using buttons, remember. If you're using safety eyes, you can go ahead and add those now, and you can still use that little under circle if you're using safety eyes. So that's Mama's face completely done. So now we need to prepare her arms, because they're going to be sewn into the seam when we sew the body together. So the first thing you need to do is press on your arm fillers on one of each of those pairs, and we've got a space all the way around for our seam and more space at the end for tucking that into our side seam. So once you've got that done, you just need to put right sides together as I have here, and we're just going to stitch. We're going to leave this end open because that's how we're going to turn it through, and we're going to sew a 4mm seam allowance from this top edge all the way around that hand and right up to here. Make sure that you back and forth at your start and finish with both of those, then we'll turn them through and give them a press. So once you have those arms stitched and turned through and you've given them a press, now you'll have a look on your pattern templates, and you'll see that you've got 2 marks either side of those shoulders on your body pieces, and that's where your arm starts. And you'll also find that it lines up perfectly with that curve. And I've just popped that one into place and just stitched just inside my seam allowance so that they're already in place, folded over in front of her. Make sure those little hands are curving upwards towards her chin. And then we're ready to add our front, back to our front. So it's as simple as lining up all of those edges, and you can use your clips or pins, whatever you like, and make sure that everything is beautifully lined up. And then we're just going to stitch. I'm going to use about a 5mm seam allowance. Starting at the base here, I'm going to stitch all the way around that edge, right down to the base again. Make sure you back and forth on your start and finish. I do like to sew that seam 2 times for strength, and I have my machine stitch length set at a number 2. So remember, we're leaving this end open because that's how we're going to fill it. So I'm going to get that one stitched up and ready to turn through. So now we're ready to turn this one through. Just before you do that, if you just go around with your little scissors and snip those obvious curves. So around here, around the head, across the top of the head here and at the side, and it'll help it all turn through and you'll get a lovely nice curve. So we're going to turn that one through and push out all of those seams using my knitting needle and get that all ready for filling. Now we're ready for filling, and we've got a little raccoon already there. It looks like a little puppet at this stage, doesn't it? Maybe that's something I should think about, designing some little hand puppets for you all. I used to do that years ago. So let's go ahead and start filling, and I do that by getting my filling with my forceps if you have them. They're very handy, and we want to get right up into those ear tips there, each side, and then just fill that one all the way up as you go. Now, if you've got a wool felting needle, you're going to find it very useful for packing this filling in because it's a big open cavity. You find it wants to jump out at you, so you really do want to keep packing that all in, and as you go, to be tucking it in with your wool felting needle. So these are readily available. You can buy them on eBay, and you can usually buy them in sets of about 6. And we use the heaviest gauge one for packing filling, so they're very, very handy. Once you use them, you will never be without them. So I'm going to get that one all filled up. I'm going to fill right up into the edge, just a little way from the edge, and we're going to pack that in and make it nice and flat, ready to pop in our supportive disc. Right, so there you can see I've got that little one all filled out, and you can see that lovely shape all comes together. And I've used my wool felting needle to pack that base section in nice and flat. I hope you can see that there, and it's very, very firm. And so now I've got that in place, I just have to add my disc. Before I do that, I've actually gone ahead and sewn with a double strand of extra strong thread, starting at the back and just about 5mm in from that base edge. You can see I've sewn a running stitch. So just a little straight running stitch. I've left the tail ends hanging so that I can tie them off, and I'm going to insert that little base, pull that one in all the way around, and that will also help compress all of that filling. I've already tied my first knot in place, so I can actually just pull that in. I've left my needle on too because I usually go around the second time. So you can see as I draw that in around that base, just make sure you're getting everything sitting nice and flat and even, and you really don't need that base pulled in much tighter than that. You just need to be able to have it pulled in enough that that felt cover that we're going to add covers this whole section here. So I will pull that right in, make sure that it's all sitting flat, and I'll knot that off about 4 times. I have those ends nicely tied off, so that base is in place. So our next step is just to add that felt cover, and I have liberally applied my clear craft glue. You can see that there all over that base, and just going to flip that one over and press this one into place. You'll see that it will fit beautifully. Just make sure that all of those edges are pushed down and that they're all lined up. And we just need to leave that one to dry. It needs to be perfectly dry before we do our final stitching on that one, and we're going to be sewing a blanket applique stitch there. We're going to have her sit there and dry, and while that's happening we can get started on the tail. Her little arms are like begging for her baby, aren't they? So let's get started on that tail. So the first thing we need to do is, we've got our 2 tail pieces there, is to press on that filler piece in the same way that we did the arms. So I've got that all pressed into place, and then we put right sides together, and you'll see that you have little marks on your template that show you where we leave an opening. So we're just going to stitch all the way around with our 4mm seam allowance, right the way around to the other mark. Make sure you back and forth. Then we're going to turn it through and give it a press just in the same way we did those arms. I have that tail all turned through and I've given it a good press, and as I've done that, I've pressed that little opening, those opening edges under, and you can see that I've just stitched a tiny little top stitch just across that opening just to close that. I keep everything else. You could top stitch this all the way around if you like, but I actually like that soft sort of finish, and of course that's going to create a lovely tail around that base there. So we can put that one aside. And now we're ready to stitch the base, felt base in place now that it's all dried. So I've got, I'm using pearl thread and I'm using 8 ply, and it's a single strand, and I've got just a knot in the end. So what I've done is I've just tucked my needle in underneath that little base plate there and taken my needle out right on the edge there through that fabric of that body, and the little knot will be hidden between those layers. So what we're actually sewing is a blanket applique stitch, but it's in a 3-dimensional style. So I'm going to I like to hold my thread back there, and I'm going to take my needle through, and I'm going to go through all of the layers and come out pretty much where I started, bringing my needle through that loop of thread and anchoring that first stitch in. So I'm going to keep my stitches to be about 4mm, and you can see each time I'm going through all the layers and coming out right on the edge of that template, making sure that I'm taking up some of that side body. Again, pulling my needle through that loop, which gives us that nice binding stitch. So it's just a matter of making your way around that whole disc. And of course you can choose a matching thread if you like. It doesn't have to be a contrasting thread. I'm just looking for any way to be able to add a little highlight to my little project here. And once you have that all sewn in place, you can see on my little mama puppy that that's how that will look. So I'm just going to continue on until that one's all stitched. Once you have that base in place, we're ready to add the eyes. So what I'm going to do is, well, I'm using buttons. So what I've done is I've taken a doubled strand of extra strong thread, and I have passed it through those buttonholes. I've gone from behind and back through the front and brought those ends together. So now I've got 4 strands, and I've put all 4 strands through the eye of my largest doll needle. So it's nice and strong, and that button is held on the end. And so now I've got my marks ready right there where I want my eyes to sit. And so I'm going to take my needle through. I'm going to come out somewhere at the back of the head, quite central if I can. And we're going to be tying these off against each other. I'm going to pull that one all the way through and get that positioned right where we want it. And remember, I said we want more of the white showing on the outer lower edge than at the top. So that one is pulled through nicely. So I can take my needle off, and before I do the same with the other side, I'm just going to make that hole there a little bit bigger. Now I'm not cutting the hole, I'm just parting those fibres, because what we're going to do now is exactly the same thing for the other eye. Get your button threaded up again, take it straight through and bring your needle out through that same hole. So my second eye is threaded through, come out the same hole there, and I've tied one preliminary knot. So I've got all those threads, and you can see that I'm going to be able to pull those in and get some nice depth there as I tie them off. You'll need to keep up the tension as you do it. Another thing to watch is that it's important to make sure that those little buttonholes are the same, lined up the same on each side. It doesn't matter whether you've got them going straight across or up and down or on a diagonal like I have, but make sure that they're the same either side. It's those little things that make all the difference. So I'm going to really pull those in and knot that off from behind. And when I knot that off, I'm actually knotting it off into the stuffing, not to the fabric. So it won't be seen. And once I've knotted that off about 4 times, I'll snip those thread ends, and those thread ends will pop back into that hole, into that head, and it will be largely invisible. Now after we've got those eyes into place, our last step is to add my little mama's tail. And so we're just going to add that from behind, and it's very simple. Using a button, what I've done there is that I found my center point at the back here, just a little way up. You can pin it into place and then check it before you stitch it into place. And what I've done is I've got a doubled strand of extra strong thread, and I have it just right on that point there of that tail, and I've gone in through the button right the way through that tail. And then I've taken up some of that fabric, you can see there, taken a little bite out of that fabric, back out, and then back out again through here, through the other hole in the button. And when we pull that all in, we're going to be able to tie and knot that one off. And just want to check that you've got enough wrap around there at the front for that tail. Once you've got that all in the right position, you just need to tie that one off, just knot it off 3 or 4 times and snip those thread ends. So there we go, that has our mama all complete. We're going to add her little press stud for her hands a little bit later, and also we'll decide whether we want to pull that tail in from behind a bit later too, once we've got baby made. So we're going to pop her aside and we're going to get started on her baby. So we've got those 2 head pieces. And the first thing you want to do is press his or her little bandit black glasses patch in place, which I've done. You'll see that it lines up perfectly either side there. And then I'm just going to stitch on the machine with a black straight stitch. I'm just going to stitch that into place across the top and that bottom line there. You could stitch it by hand if you like, but it does need to be stitched on in some way just in case that lifts off. So I'm going to get that one in place. So there you can see I've got that little visor piece stitched into place. I've actually stitched it in white across the top because everything's very grey and black here, and I want a bit of a highlight there. I stitched the lower edge in black, and I've added that button there for the nose. If you don't have a button that small, you could have a little bead or perhaps just a couple of stitches to indicate a nose there. It's a very simple design. So my next step is we're going to sew that head front to the head back, and we're not turning this one through, so we're going to line them up exactly front to back. We're going to be adding 2 little stitches for sleepy eyes, but we're going to do that once the head is filled. So once you've got those pieces together there, I've got a single strand of extra strong thread. You can use embroidery thread if you like. I find the extra strong thread is very neat and it works very well for this sort of work. I've got a knot in the end and it's just a single strand. So it's a blanket stitch that we're sewing, and it's a very tiny one. Now if you haven't sewn a blanket stitch before, there'll be a link at the top there that I will give you to my video that shows you exactly how to sew it. But basically, I'm just going to anchor my first stitch in there. So blanket stitch is when we go through all of the layers evenly, straight through the other side, bring our needle through, and as we bring our needle through, we're bringing it through the loop. So much like the blanket applique stitch we did on the base of Mama, and we're pulling that through the loop so that again, it's giving us that little binding stitch across the top. And I am doing it in white here because again I want a bit of a contrast. I want this little face to stand out. I'm keeping my stitches really small and coming out through the loop each time, you can see there, and pulling that one in, and that's going to give me that nice little stitch that's going to hold everything together. Do keep those stitches very small because we don't want any filling to escape between those. So through all the layers, bring our needle out through the loop each time. And you can see there, that's giving me that lovely binding. That we're going to continue right the way around. I'm picking up every bit of polyester filling here. We're going to go right the way around, under that chin, up to the other side of that lower ear, and I'm going to leave my needle on my thread and leave my thread on, because then we're going to fill that little head through the top. So here you can see I've got that the little lower edge of that head all stitched up, and I've gone ahead and added some filling. I've got my needle left on there, and I've added a little bit of filling. I've used my tiny forceps here to tuck that polyester filling in there, and then gone ahead with my felting needle just to pack it all in there, and it stops it coming out at me. So well, we're just going to add a tiny little bit of craft glue to just the backs of those ears and the very top of that head. It's just to seal those just before we stitch them. We'll hold it all together. Squeeze those shut. Just make sure they're lined up. Just remove any excess there. And we can add our clips there. That'll help keep those closed while it's drying. Now that'll just need to dry for about 10 minutes or so. And once it is dried, we're just going to continue on with that blanket stitch around the top edge of each ear and down to the side there. And that will be completed. But give it a good 10 minutes or so to dry first. Okay, so that's my little raccoon head all filled and that top opening closed. And now I'm just going to add a couple of little white stitches just to create a little indication of a closed eye in there. I have to use white because I'm working with the black there. And generally I wouldn't use white like this, but it's just, as I said, this design is very, very simple and it's really colour based. So I've come in from behind and I'm using my 8-ply pearl thread. It's a single strand. Come in from behind, my knot's hidden back there. It won't be seen because that's where we attach the head. So I've just come in. Remember that our raccoon's eyes are quite close together. So quite close to the centre there. And then I'm just going to take that stitch in just at a little bit of an angle, angling down, and I'm going to go out the back. And I'll just want to pull that stitch in. And you can see there, that's just got that little eye placed in there. Now you want to keep that tension up because you want some nice pull in there. Pulling that in is what will sculpt that tiny little face and give it just a little bit of 3D effect there. So I will anchor that stitch and then I'll come back in from behind and repeat that on the other side. There we go, that's our completed little baby raccoon head. We're just going to pop that one aside for a minute and we're going to move on to the body pieces. Now your body pieces are very straightforward. They're just your little pieces of double felt, and what I've gone ahead and done is sewn that tiny blanket stitch, the same one that we did around the head, around each of those pieces. You can hide your knot at the front of each of those pieces because we're going to be putting this little baby together like this. So we're not going to see any of those knots and everything's kept nice and tidy. So once you've got those stitched and all ready, we're going to add a tail. Now, this I found to be the easiest way to add a tiny tail to something that was only one-dimensional. So we don't have any filling in that, so we can't really hide too much in there in the way of stitches. So what I thought I'd do is create that little tail with some beads. You can see that I've done that there. It's just a double thread, and I've gone through the first one, taken my double threads and threaded the rest of them on. So there they are. And now I'm going to create a little belly button at the front there, which will allow me to pass stitches through while I attach the tail. So my tail is going to be about central at the back there. It's not an exact science. Just get that one pretty much where you want it. Pull that one all the way through and make sure that it's not pulled super tight like that. We don't want his little tail to be sticking out like that. We want it to just sit nicely. So once you have that in the right position, we're just going to create a tiny little star pattern that indicates that little belly button. That gives us an excuse for having stitches showing. And that way it doesn't look odd there. Our little tail is hanging down. It's as simple as that. Really, it's just a little couple of stitches there. Tail's hanging nicely, and we can cast off at the back and then slip our needle in between the two layers and snip that off. So there you go. That has that little tail in place. And now we're just going to put our body together, which is really simple. We're just going to line the little arms up to the top of the neckline there, and we're going to want to come through the back. I've got a double strand of extra strong thread that I'm using here to make this joint. And we're just going to come through one side. And then you want to have a look at that little raccoon head and decide where you want that to sit. It needs to sit pretty low on his shoulders. So he's got that little sort of hunched over sort of look, which generally means it's about the middle of the back of the head. So I'm then going to travel across, take a nice big bite out the back of that head there. Make sure it's nice and parallel. Straight across, and then we just come back in the other side through all those layers. Pull that one through. Make sure that your threads aren't twisted. And you can pull on both those thread ends and you can check that placement there. And you can check that you've got some nice mobility there of that little head and those arms. And once you have, you just need to knot those thread ends off about 4 times. Keep the tension up so it's nice and tight. And that's our little baby done. And so there we go, we have our little finished mama raccoon, and you can see baby sits nicely in there. Now the couple of final touches that you'll need to do is I've just added my little press stud there. Make sure that when you're sewing those on, those little press studs, you sew them on in a way where you don't show stitches through that front paw there. Just so that's all nice and tidy. The little tail, mama's tail, you can leave it just wrapped around like that and it will sit quite well there because baby's foot tends to hold it there. But if you do want to throw a stitch in, you can do that from behind. Take your doll needle through and just pull a stitch through back to the back again and tie it off. Then you'll find that will always sit nicely. And of course, there's so many ways you can brighten this one up. I've stayed with those very basic colours, but I really do like that colour scheme. A lot of my house is very greys and blacks like that, so she will sit nicely somewhere. But you could really brighten this one up. Now, of course, you could do 2 babies. You could add something like a lovely little floral headband or something with a couple of feathers, that very woodland animal sort of a look, or perhaps a little blankie through her arms, something to add a little pop of colour. I'm sure you're going to do great things with this one. And if you have enjoyed this one, of course, we've got a couple of others in the same sort of style, that very simple kawaii style, which is really quick and easy to make, and they really are just such a striking little gift, and great to sit on an office desk even, and fabulous for nurseries. And if you go and have a look at my playlist, you'll see that there's quite a few more. I think, what have I got here? They're all looking at me here, and I've got an owl and funny bunnies and a kitty, so lots to choose from, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I hope this has been a nice quick break for you all. I know there've been a couple of challenging patterns recently, but it's really nice to make something simple and quick and easy, and these really are great for gifts. So I'd love to see your finished creation, so why not come and join our Facebook page. It's a very friendly group, and you get to share all of your Lisa Pei creations, and people are showing me their collections, and so many of you have made such a great many of my patterns and taking photos of them all together. That's my favourite thing to see. So I'm looking forward to seeing more. So make sure you come along and join. I'm going to put the description, put the link for that group in the description box below too. So come along and join us. So you can also talk to me on Instagram and see what else I'm up to. And I try and keep you updated all the time with upcoming patterns. If you haven't subscribed, come and join us, because there's so many more of these little guys to come along. Lots of varied patterns coming your way, and they are always free. So everybody have a fantastic creative week. Thank you for all your support. I'm looking forward to seeing all of your goodies during the week as usual, and everybody stay safe most of all. Now, when those beautiful things come to you in your day that make you happy, make sure that you pay them forward. And until next time, it's Huru from me.